The Duke of Alistair Beaumont dictated the letter with the same dispassionate precision he applied to the acquisition of a new tenant farm or the felling of old-growth timber. His solicitor, Mr. Finch, a man whose spine had long ago curved into a permanent question mark from decades of poring over ducal documents, scratched away with his nib, the sound a dry whisper in the cavernous study. The room smelled of leather, beeswax, and the quiet, unassailable authority of generations of Beaumont men. "She is of good family, though impoverished," the Duke continued, his gaze fixed on the rain-lashed window that overlooked 1,000 acres of his land. The Vances were ever respectable. The father, a country parson, had the misfortune of a sound mind and a gambler's spirit. A fatal combination. Mr. Finch did not look up. He was merely a vessel for the Duke's will, a conduit for instructions that would alter lives and landscapes. The marriage settles the late parson's debts, which are considerable, and in return, the small Vance holding Greyfell passes to my estate. It is a strategically vital parcel. Her presence here will be decorous. She is quiet, plain, but not offensively so. She will produce an heir and manage the household staff. I require nothing more. A log shifted in the great stone hearth, spitting a shower of orange sparks against the fire screen. The Duke paused, his thoughts turning to the practicalities of integrating this new human component into the well-oiled machinery of his life. He had met Miss Eleanor Vance on 3 separate occasions. Each time, she had been dressed in a modest gray that seemed to absorb the light around her. She spoke only when addressed, her eyes downcast, her hands perfectly still in her lap. She was, he had concluded, the perfect solution. A woman who would occupy the space of Duchess without disturbing the profound, orderly silence of his existence. She was a blank page upon which the duties of her station could be written. One final instruction, Finch, on the matter of the estate itself. The scratching of the nib paused. The new Duchess is to be given full authority over the domestic staff, the menus, the linens, the usual feminine trifles. However, you will ensure all financial matters, all ledgers, all accounts pertaining to the Blackwood estate and its holdings remain exclusively under our purview. Make this clear to Mr. Hobbs, the estate manager. He turned from the window, his gray eyes as cool and clear as a winter morning. He fixed his gaze upon the solicitor, impressing the weight of the command. She is a parson's daughter, not a financier. She will have her pin money and a household budget, of course, but under no circumstances is she to be troubled with the complexities of our business. Do not let her near the accounts. The finality of the statement hung in the air, as solid and immovable as the granite walls of the manor. Mr. Finch made a final, decisive scratch on the parchment, blotted the ink, and gave a slight, assenting bow of his head. The matter was settled. The Duchess would be acquired, the land absorbed, and the accounts protected from the perceived frailty of the feminine mind. Alistair Beaumont, Duke of Blackwood, felt a sense of satisfaction. It was a neat, elegant transaction. It was, in every conceivable way, a perfectly managed piece of business. Eleanor Vance understood transactions. Her father, for all his theological brilliance, had viewed life as a series of wagers with God, with fortune, with the burgeoning stock market of London. He had taught her mathematics, not with sums on a slate, but with risk assessments and calculations of potential yield. He had loved numbers for their purity, for the elegant, irrefutable truth they revealed. It was a love he had passed on to his only child, a secret education conducted late at night in his dusty study, long after the rest of the world believed a parson's daughter should be asleep. She knew, therefore, precisely what she was. She was the final settlement on her father's last disastrous wager. She was the human currency used to purchase her family's honor and secure the small plot of land that was all that remained of their name. She did not begrudge the Duke his purchase. The world was a marketplace, and a woman of her standing, with no dowry and a stained family ledger, had little value. To be chosen by a duke, for any reason, was a miracle of commerce. She had observed him during their brief, formal encounters. He was a man made of straight lines and hard angles, his conversation as economical as his tailored coats. He did not look at her so much as assess her, his eyes cataloging her quiet demeanor, her plain dress, her lack of artifice. She understood what he saw. He saw a placid creature, a decorative object that would not chip or fade or demand to be dusted too often. He saw a void that he could fill with his name and his child. She allowed him to see it. It was the most valuable asset she possessed, the ability to be invisible. In a world that so often punished women for their presence, she had perfected the art of absence. She listened, she watched, she calculated, and she said nothing. Her silence was not empty. It was full of observation. Their wedding was a stately, bloodless affair. Alistair performed his role with flawless propriety. He was not unkind. He was simply not present. He stood beside her at the altar, a handsome, powerful stranger, and his thoughts, she sensed, were on crop yields and timber prices. He was acquiring a duchess, and he was doing it with the same sober focus he would give to any other significant investment. When he slipped the heavy gold ring onto her finger, it felt less like a symbol of union and more like the final seal on a deed of transfer. She was now the Duchess of Blackwood. She belonged to the estate, another column in its vast and complex ledger. Their first dinner as man and wife was a study in polite emptiness. The dining hall at Blackwood Manor was a cavern of baronial splendor, its walls lined with tapestries of ancient battles and portraits of stern-faced ancestors. The table was a mile of polished mahogany, and they sat at opposite ends, two small figures dwarfed by the weight of history and expectation. Alistair spoke of the estate. He outlined her duties with the air of a chairman briefing a new board member. She was to consult with Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, regarding the running of the household. She would be responsible for social correspondence. Her allowance would be deposited quarterly. Eleanor listened, her hands resting in her lap, her expression one of serene attentiveness. She was a still pool, reflecting the Duke's directives without a ripple. "The south wing requires new linens," he said, gesturing vaguely with his fork. "The current ones are threadbare. See to it. Purchase whatever is necessary." "Of course," she replied, her voice soft. Then a flicker of the mind she kept so carefully hidden escaped. Would it not be more prudent to purchase the flax directly from the tenant farmers in the North Valley and have the maids spin it here? The looms in the attic are in good repair. It would be a significant saving over purchasing finished goods from London, and it would provide winter work for the tenants' wives. The Duke paused, his wineglass halfway to his lips. He stared at her down the long expanse of the table. It was the first time he had truly looked at her since the wedding ceremony. He saw not a blank page, but a flicker of unexpected script. For a moment, he was genuinely surprised. The suggestion was not just sensible, it was strategically sound, showing an understanding of vertical integration that he would have praised in his estate manager. "An interesting thought," he said slowly. But the moment of recalibration was brief. He dismissed it almost immediately. It was a piece of country thrift, the kind of knowledge a parson's daughter would naturally possess. It was quaint. It meant nothing. He had already categorized her, filed her away in the cabinet of his mind under Duchess, placid, and uncomplicated. To reconsider would be to upset the perfect order of his world. A commendable notion of economy, to be sure, he said, his tone once again distant and dismissive. However, Mrs. Gable is more than capable of handling such matters. Simply inform her of your preference. He had, in essence, patted her on the head and told her to run along. Eleanor inclined her head. As you wish, Your Grace. The ripple on the surface of the pool vanished. The stillness returned. She had offered a glimpse of her true self, and he had turned away. The lesson was noted, the calculation made. She would not make the same mistake again. Blackwood Manor absorbed her. She moved through its grand, cold rooms like a ghost, a whisper of gray silk against ancient stone. She performed her duties with quiet, flawless efficiency. The household ran more smoothly than ever before. The new linens, purchased from London at great expense, as per the Duke's implicit instruction, were of the highest quality. The menus were balanced, the staff content. She was the perfect Duchess. She was precisely what he had wanted. She was given a small morning room for her personal use, a space that had long been neglected. It had a fine view of the formal gardens, but was drafty and filled with unwanted furniture. It was here, in the third week of her marriage, that she found the letter. She had been attempting to bring order to a towering secretary desk, a monstrous piece of mahogany filled with forgotten papers and dried-up inkwells. Behind a drawer that had gone off its runners, she found a slim leather folio. It was not old. The leather was still supple. Curious, she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of crisp parchment. It was a copy of a letter written in the neat, looping hand of Mr. Finch. Her eyes scanned the familiar legalistic phrases until they snagged on her own name. It was a letter from her husband, the Duke, to his solicitor, dated 2 days before their wedding. She read his assessment of her. Quiet, plain, decorous. She read the clinical summary of the transaction that had made her a duchess. She felt a strange, cold detachment, as if reading about a stranger. This was business. She understood business. Then she reached the final paragraph. You will ensure all financial matters, all ledgers, all accounts pertaining to the Blackwood estate and its holdings remain exclusively under our purview. She is a parson's daughter, not a financier. Do not let her near the accounts. The words did not strike her like a blow. They settled inside her like a layer of fine, cold dust, covering everything. It was not the insult that chilled her. It was the totality of the dismissal. He had not just misjudged her. He had decreed her incapable. He had looked at her and seen a simpleton, a creature to be managed and protected from the complexities of the world. He had built a cage for her, not of iron bars, but of his own limited perception. She stood there for a long time, the letter in her hand, the silence of the room pressing in on her. There was no surge of anger, no welling of tears. Her father had taught her that emotion was a liability in any calculation. What she felt was a profound, clarifying stillness. She now knew the precise dimensions of her cage. With meticulous care, Eleanor folded the letter along its original creases. The folds were sharp, exact. It was the fold of a decision made, a door closed. She slipped the parchment back into the folio and slid the folio back into its hiding place behind the drawer. She did not wish to possess the evidence of her own insignificance. She only needed to remember that it existed. Section. From that moment, a subtle change occurred. To the outside world, she was the same. She was the quiet, efficient Duchess of Blackwood. But inside, the last flicker of hope for a partnership, for a meeting of minds, was extinguished. She had been purchased to be a quiet fixture, and a quiet fixture she would be. She would perform her duties. She would uphold his name, and she would give him the air he required. But she would not give him herself. That, she decided, was a currency he did not even know existed, and for which he had not paid. The music stopped. That was the first thing Alistair noticed. Or rather, it was the first thing he registered in the slow, creeping accumulation of things that were not quite right. For the first few months of his marriage, there had been music in the evenings. His new wife, he had discovered, played the pianoforte. She did not play with the flashy brilliance of the young ladies on the marriage market, but with a quiet, thoughtful complexity that was, he had grudgingly admitted to himself, rather pleasant. It filled the vast, echoing spaces of the manor with something other than silence. Then, one day, it was gone. The lid of the pianoforte in the drawing room remained closed, its polished surface reflecting the flickering firelight like a dark, still pond. The sheet music vanished from its stand. He did not ask about it. To ask would be to admit he had noticed, and to admit he had noticed would be to admit that her actions had an effect on him, which was an untidy and inconvenient thought. He assumed it was a passing mood. But the silence that replaced the music did not pass. It settled. It grew. His life, on the surface, was perfect. The Duchess was a paragon of aristocratic duty. She managed the household with an invisible hand. Dinners appeared, laundry was done, guests were received with serene grace. She was always impeccably dressed, always polite. She was everything he had told Mr. Finch he wanted, and it was beginning to drive him mad. He started to notice other absences. Her conversation, which had once been sparse but occasionally punctuated by a dry, intelligent observation, was now a wasteland of perfect, meaningless pleasantries. "The weather is much improved, Your Grace." "The venison was excellent this evening, Your Grace." "I trust your day was productive, Your Grace." She never called him Alistair, not once since their wedding day. He found himself watching her across the dinner table, trying to penetrate the placid mask of her face. Her eyes, a shade of hazel he had once thought unremarkable, now seemed vast and unreadable. She looked at him, but he had the unnerving sensation that she did not see him. He was merely an object in her field of vision, a chair, a tapestry, the Duke. She was present and she was absent. She was there and she was not there. He began to feel like a man living with a beautiful, exquisitely crafted automaton. She moved, she spoke, she performed her functions, but the animating spark, the ghost in the machine, was gone. Or perhaps, he thought with a flicker of unease, it had never been there at all. Perhaps he had been correct in his initial assessment, and the brief flashes of wit and insight had been mere anomalies. This explanation was more comforting. It meant his judgment was sound. It meant the crushing emptiness of his perfect marriage was not his fault. It was simply the nature of the woman he had chosen. But the explanation did not satisfy him. It felt like a lie. He started cataloging more clues. He noticed that the books on the table beside her favorite chair in the drawing room went unread, the marker never moving from the same page for weeks on end. He passed her designated morning room and saw that it remained in its state of dusty neglect, a repository for unwanted things. She spent most of her time in a small, glass-paned conservatory at the far end of the West Wing, a place he had not set foot in for years. One afternoon, driven by a nameless restlessness, he sought her there. He found her standing before a long bench of orchids, their strange, exotic blooms a riot of color in the humid air. She was tending to them with the intense, focused concentration of a scholar examining a rare text. She did not notice his arrival. She was misting a spray of white, moth-like flowers, her touch delicate, her expression one of profound engagement. It was the first time in months he had seen her look truly alive. He watched her for a full minute, unseen. Here, in this forgotten corner of his house, she had cultivated a secret world, a place of complexity and beauty that had nothing to do with him. The sight filled him with a strange and unwelcome emotion. It felt like resentment. It felt like loss. He cleared his throat. She started, her composure instantly returning. The engaged, animated woman vanished, replaced by the serene, placid Duchess. "Your Grace," she said, her voice perfectly even. "Can I be of assistance?" "I was merely taking a walk," he said, the words sounding lame even to his own ears. He gestured at the flowers. "I had forgotten about this place. You have a talent for these things." "They require patience," she said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of any personal inflection. "Indeed." An awkward silence fell between them, thick and humid as the air. He wanted to ask her something, to say something that would breach the wall of her politeness, but he did not know the words. He did not know how to speak the language of the woman standing before him. He only knew how to issue directives. "Well," he said finally, "carry on." He turned and left, feeling foolish and strangely diminished. The image of her face, softened and alive as she tended to her orchids, haunted him for the rest of the day. He had married a shadow, yet here was proof of a vibrant, hidden life, a life from which he was entirely excluded. The catalyst came from an unexpected quarter. Mr. Finch, his solicitor, had come down from London to review the quarterly reports. They were in the Duke's study, the same room where the fateful letter had been dictated nearly a year before. Alistair was complaining. "The yields from the Greyfell plot are still underperforming," he grumbled, staring at a column of disappointing figures. "Hobbs has tried everything. New drainage, more fertilizer. Nothing seems to work. It's a mire of inefficiency." Mr. Finch adjusted his spectacles. "A curious thing, Your Grace. I was reviewing the late Parson's papers during the settlement of his estate. He had extensive notes on that very land. He believed the soil had a peculiar mineral composition, one that exhausted itself quickly with traditional crop rotation. He had developed a rather complex 7-year cycle involving clover and root vegetables to replenish it." Alistair looked up from the ledger. "The parson? I thought he spent his time reading Greek and losing money." "He did both with great enthusiasm," Finch said with a dry cough. "But his private passion was agricultural science. His calculations were, well, they were quite brilliant, actually. It's a great pity he never had the capital to implement his theories." The solicitor paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "He taught his daughter everything he knew. She had a remarkable head for figures, he used to say. Quite unnatural in a female, of course, but there you are." The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. A remarkable head for figures. She is a parson's daughter, not a financier. The two sentences collided in Alistair's mind, creating a sickening lurch. He thought of her quiet, sensible suggestion about the linens, a suggestion he had dismissed as mere country thrift. He thought of the intense concentration on her face in the conservatory, the look of a mind deeply engaged in a complex problem. He thought of the vast, unnerving intelligence he sometimes glimpsed behind her placid eyes before she shuttered it away. A cold dread began to seep into his bones. He dismissed Finch an hour later, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and dawning horror. He paced the study, the solicitor's words echoing in his ears. A remarkable head for figures. He felt an urgent, inexplicable need to go to her morning room, the one she never used. The room was just as he remembered it, cold, dusty, and filled with the ghosts of forgotten things. He walked to the monstrous secretary desk. He did not know what he was looking for, only that he had to look. He pulled at the drawers, his movements jerky and uncertain. One of them stuck. He remembered Eleanor mentioning it. He jiggled it, and it came loose. Behind it, tucked into the dark recess, was a slim leather folio. His heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drumbeat against his ribs. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, what he was about to find. He pulled the folio out. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he opened it. There it was, the copy of his letter. He sank into the nearest chair, the parchment cold against his fingertips. He read his own arrogant, dismissive words. "Do not let her near the accounts." It was a death sentence, not to a life, but to a mind. He had looked at a brilliant, analytical woman, a woman who might have been his partner, his equal, and he had declared her a fool. And she had seen it. She had read his judgment of her. He looked at the creases in the paper. They were sharp, precise. This was not a letter that had been crumpled in anger or stained with tears. It had been read, understood, and folded away with cold, deliberate finality. It was the closing of a book, the end of a chapter that had never even been allowed to begin. Everything snapped into place. The silent pianoforte, the stilted, formal conversations, the empty eyes, the retreat into the secret world of her orchids. It was not melancholy. It was not vapidity. It was a choice. It was her answer to his edict. He had commanded her to be a simpleton, a decorative object, and she had obeyed him with terrifying, literal precision. She had given him exactly what he asked for, a hollow duchess for his hollow life. He had not merely insulted her, he had erased her. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of his mistake stole the air from his lungs. He had prided himself on his perception, his ability to assess value, to manage his assets with perfect logic. And in the most important transaction of his life, he had made a catastrophic error. He had looked at a diamond and declared it to be glass. He sat there for a long time, in the cold, dusty room, the letter lying in his lap like a condemnation. The silence of the house pressed in on him, but for the first time, he understood its source. It was not an absence of sound. It was the presence of a vast, unspoken judgment. His wife, the quiet woman in gray, had been watching him, weighing him, and finding him wanting, and he, in his monumental blindness, had never even known he was on the scales. He had to find her. He did not know what he would say, what he could possibly say to undo the damage he had wrought. The words, "I am sorry," felt laughably inadequate, a tiny bandage for a mortal wound. But he knew he could not let another day pass in the cold, silent tomb he had built for them both. He strode through the manor, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He did not look for her in the drawing room or the library. He knew where she would be. He went to the West Wing, to the conservatory, the only place in his house where she seemed to exist in her own right. He found her there, just as before, standing among her orchids. The late afternoon sun streamed through the glass panes, illuminating the motes of dust dancing in the humid air and casting a soft glow on her face. She was examining a bloom, her head tilted, and for a moment he saw her again as he had before, the intelligent, engaged woman, lost in a world of her own making. He stopped in the doorway, the letter clutched in his hand. She turned, sensing his presence, and the mask of the Duchess fell back into place. Her expression became placid, her posture formal. "Your Grace." He walked towards her, his boots crunching on the gravel path between the planters. He did not stop until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough to see the tiny flecks of gold in her hazel eyes. He held out the letter. Her gaze dropped to the parchment, and for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something, surprise, pain, crossed her face before it was gone, replaced by the same serene emptiness. "I found this," he said, his voice hoarse, "in your morning room." She said nothing. She simply looked at the letter, her hands remaining clasped in front of her. "I was wrong," he said. The words felt heavy, clumsy, but necessary. They were the first true words he had spoken to her in a year. "I was a blind, arrogant fool." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not make excuses. He simply stated the truth as he now understood it. He had committed an act of profound ignorance, and he had to own it completely. "I dismissed you," he continued, the confession pouring out of him now, a torrent of belated understanding. "I looked at you and I saw nothing, a convenience, a solution. I never once thought to look for the person, for the mind. I read this letter and I understood everything. The silence, the music, why the music stopped." Her composure remained flawless, but he saw a slight tightening around her mouth. It was the only sign that his words were reaching her. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He had to do more than apologize. He had to act. An apology was a word. He needed a deed. He needed to prove that this was not just a moment of contrition, but a fundamental shift in his perception. He turned and strode from the conservatory without another word. He left her standing there, among her orchids, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. He marched directly to his study, his purpose clear and absolute. He went to the great oak cabinets where the estate records were kept. He began to pull them out. The ledgers, the account books, the survey maps. They were heavy, bound in dark green and black leather, filled with the dense, spidery script of generations of estate managers. They were the heart of his world, the source of his power and his identity. He carried them, stack by heavy stack, back to the conservatory. He did not care about the dirt on his coat or the strain in his arms. He laid them on the stone floor at her feet, a trove of leather and parchment. The books that contained the soul of Blackwood Manor, the books he had forbidden her to see. He stood back, breathing heavily, and looked at her. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the mountain of ledgers. "The Blackwood accounts," he said, his voice raw. "They have a persistent issue with the tenant farms on the Greyfell plot. Mr. Finch mentioned your father's theories. I am at a loss." He met her gaze, and for the first time, he allowed her to see past the Duke to the man beneath, a man who was flawed, who had made a terrible mistake, and who was now, finally, asking for help. "I would be grateful," he said, the words costing him more pride than any admission of financial failure ever could. For your perspective. It was not an apology. It was a capitulation. It was an offering. It was the key to the cage he had built, laid at her feet. Now, he could only wait and see if she would choose to use it. Eleanor looked from the pile of ledgers on the floor to the man standing before her. For the first time since she had read his letter, she allowed herself to truly see him. He was not the imperious duke, the master of Blackwood. He was a man humbled, his face etched with a genuine, painful regret. The wall of his arrogance had crumbled, and in its place was a raw, uncertain vulnerability. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel pity. She felt a quiet, analytical curiosity. This was a new variable, a change in the fundamental equation of their lives. It required a new calculation. She did not immediately kneel to pick up a ledger. She did not offer him the soft, immediate forgiveness he might have expected from the woman he thought he had married. The wound he had inflicted was not a thing of passion. It was a deep, structural flaw in the foundation of their marriage. It could not be patched with a single grand gesture. Instead, she met his gaze, and her own was clear, steady, and devoid of emotion. "The problem with Greyfell is not the crop rotation," she said, her voice calm and precise. "Not entirely. That addresses the symptom, not the cause. The cause is the water table." Alistair stared at her, dumbfounded. "The south field on the Greyfell plot has always been marshy, but the drainage reports from the last 5 years show a consistent, unnatural increase in ground saturation, even in dry seasons," she continued, as if reciting from a textbook. "My father suspected that Lord Ashworth was diverting the upper stream that feeds the Blackwood Reservoir, but he could never prove it. Ashworth's land is higher than ours. A small, strategically placed dam would redirect enough water to slowly waterlog our lower fields while increasing his own pasture land. It would be an act of subtle, long-term theft." The depth and specificity of her analysis was staggering. She had not only understood the problem he was struggling with. She had already moved 3 steps beyond his own estate manager. She had been thinking about it. All this time, behind her silent facade, her mind had been working, analyzing, solving the problems of the estate she was forbidden to touch. How could you possibly know that?" he stammered. "I read," she said simply. "My father's journals are in the library, and I listen. The farmers talk. One only has to pay attention. One only has to pay attention." The words were a quiet, devastating indictment of his entire way of being. She finally knelt, but not in supplication. Her movement was graceful and businesslike. She selected a single, slim ledger from the pile, the one detailing water rights and boundary lines. She rose and held it, not as if he had given it to her, but as if she were taking possession of it. "I will look at these," she said. Her tone was not that of a wife agreeing to help her husband. It was the tone of a consultant agreeing to take on a new client. "I will require full access to all estate records, including correspondence with neighboring landowners, and I will need to speak with Mr. Hobbs and the tenant farmers directly." She was not asking for permission. She was stating her terms. "Of course," he said immediately. "Anything you need." "Very well," she said. She turned, the ledger held securely in her hand, and walked towards the door of the conservatory. She was not retreating. She was advancing to a new field of engagement. This was a renegotiation, not a reconciliation. He had offered her the accounts. She had accepted the work, but she had not yet accepted him. Thus began the strangest period of Alistair's life. The vast, silent manor transformed into a shared workspace. The Duke's study, once his exclusive domain, became their headquarters. Eleanor claimed the large mahogany desk, covering its polished surface with maps, charts, and pages of her own neat, precise calculations. Alistair found himself relegated to a side table, tasked with fetching old documents from the archives and writing letters at her direction. The power dynamic had been inverted completely. He was no longer the Duke issuing edicts. He was the junior associate, taking instruction from the brilliant mind he had once dismissed. And he found, to his astonishment, that he did not mind. In fact, he was fascinated. He watched her work. He saw the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she bit her lower lip as she cross-referenced a series of figures. He saw the swift, elegant logic of her mind as she peeled back layers of mismanagement and obfuscation to get to the heart of a problem. She was not just good with numbers, she was a strategist, a visionary. She saw the estate not as a collection of assets, but as a living ecosystem, where the health of the tenants, the soil, and the finances were all interconnected. The silence between them changed. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of unspoken resentment. It became a comfortable, productive silence, punctuated by the rustle of paper and quiet, focused questions. Alistair, could you find the rainfall totals for 1823? Eleanor, Hobbs reports that Ashworth has built a new fence along the northern boundary. Do you think it's significant? He brought her tea in the afternoons. He learned that she liked it with a slice of lemon, no sugar. He noticed that when she was tired, she would unconsciously tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. He began to see her not as a duchess, not as a financier, but as Eleanor, a person, a woman of incredible depth and quiet, formidable strength. Together they uncovered the truth. Eleanor's theory was correct. Lord Ashworth, their smug and supercilious neighbor, had indeed constructed a hidden sluice gate to divert water from their stream. Armed with Eleanor's meticulous documentation, maps, historical water levels, and sworn affidavits from tenants she had personally interviewed, Alistair confronted him. Ashworth, faced with irrefutable proof, crumbled immediately, agreeing to dismantle the dam and pay reparations for the damage. The resolution of the conflict should have felt like a victory, but as they stood in the study after receiving Ashworth's letter of capitulation, Alistair felt a pang of anxiety. The project that had brought them together was over. He feared that with the ledgers closed, the silence would return, that she would retreat once more into her private world. He could not let that happen. That evening, he found her in the conservatory. The orchids were in full, glorious bloom, a testament to her patient, dedicated care. She was standing before a spray of blossoms the color of a twilight sky, her fingers gently tracing the edge of a petal. He did not speak of the accounts or of Lord Ashworth. "I have been thinking," he began, his voice softer than he intended, "about all the things I failed to see." She turned to him, her expression watchful. "I saw a quiet woman, and I assumed she was simple. I heard silence, and I assumed it was empty. I never thought that quiet could be a place of observation, or that silence could be a place of thought." He took a step closer. "I have spent the last weeks admiring your mind, Eleanor. It is a brilliant, beautiful thing, and I was a fool to have overlooked it. But it is not just your mind." He looked around at the vibrant, thriving plants. "I have come to admire the woman who can bring such beauty into the world. The woman who plays Mozart with such feeling that it breaks a man's heart when she stops. The woman whose wit, when she chooses to use it, is sharper and truer than any sword. He was standing before her now, his heart in his throat. This was a greater risk than confronting Ashworth, a greater gamble than any investment. I married you as a business arrangement. I asked you to be my duchess. It was the single most foolish act of my life. He reached out and tentatively took her hand. Her skin was warm, and she did not pull away. I am asking you now, Eleanor, if you would consider being my wife, my partner, in all things. Not because of a contract, but because I have, against all my better judgment and deserving, fallen in love with you. Eleanor looked at their joined hands, then up at his face. She saw no artifice there, no ducal pride. She saw only a man, stripped bare, offering her the one thing she had never expected: his heart. A slow, small smile touched her lips. It was the first genuine smile she had given him since their wedding day. It transformed her face, lighting it from within. "Alistair," she said, and the sound of his given name on her lips was a kind of music. "I believe those are terms I can accept." A year later, the Duke's study was unrecognizable. It was now their study. A large partner's desk had replaced the imposing mahogany monolith, and they often worked, side by side, their papers mingling. Books of poetry were stacked next to agricultural journals. A vase of orchids from the conservatory always sat on the mantelpiece. The house was no longer silent. The sound of the pianoforte was a regular evening occurrence, and often Alistair would simply sit in a nearby chair and listen, content. Laughter, a sound once entirely foreign to the halls of Blackwood, was now heard with surprising frequency. Eleanor sat by the fire, a book resting in her lap. Her free hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach. She was reading a passage aloud to Alistair, her voice filled with its old, dry wit. He was not looking at the ledgers spread before him. He was looking at her. He thought of the man he had been, the man who had dictated that cold, arrogant letter. He felt a distant pity for him. That Duke had sought order and control, and in doing so had nearly condemned himself to a life of sterile emptiness. He had wanted a duchess who would cause no trouble, a woman who would not disturb the quiet of his world. He had gotten so much more. He had gotten a partner who challenged him, a wife who delighted him, a woman who had taken the barren soil of his life and cultivated it into something rich and vibrant and alive. He had written a letter to his solicitor with a stark warning. Do not let her near the accounts. It was the greatest mistake he had ever made, and the source of his greatest happiness. For it was the accounts that had forced him to see her, to finally understand the incalculable value of the woman he had married. And in truly seeing her, he had, at long last, found himself,